The Carter household sat in the heart of Willow Creek, a town where life was simple and the unspoken rules of decency held sway over everyone. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the hum of crickets and the distant whistle of a train created a comforting symphony. Inside the Carter home, 13-year-old Lily sat at the kitchen table, scribbling notes into her journal. Her long, auburn hair framed a face that still carried traces of childhood but hinted at the young woman she was becoming. She was diligent, focused, and full of dreams of becoming a doctor, of traveling far beyond Willow Creek. Her parents, James and Susan, moved about the house in their usual rhythm. James, a man of unwavering principles, sat on the couch with a newspaper spread open before him, a glass of iced tea on the side table. He was a man who believed in structure and discipline, a mindset that had served him well as the owner of a small hardware store. Susan, by contrast, had a softer demeanor. She hummed quietly as she folded laundry, her movements precise but warm, her gaze occasionally drifting toward Lily with motherly pride. That night, however, something unspoken lingered in the air. Lily's heart raced as she finished her writing. Hidden under her bed upstairs was a secret she had yet to reveal, a positive pregnancy test. The weight of it was crushing. She had discovered the truth only days earlier, and since then, her life had been an endless loop of panic and guilt. The father, Ryan, a boy from her school, had distanced himself the moment she told him. Taking a deep breath, Lily set her pen down and walked to the living room. Her parents looked up, James with his usual stern expression and Susan with a questioning smile. "Can we talk?" Lily's voice wavered, her hands trembling slightly. James folded his newspaper, raising an eyebrow. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" Lily hesitated, her gaze flickering between them. I have something to tell you. And it's important." The air grew tense. Susan sat beside James, her concern evident. "Go ahead, Lily. Whatever it is, we're here for you." For a fleeting moment, Lily believed her mother's reassurance. But as the words left her mouth, the world seemed to shatter around her. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was deafening. James's face turned an alarming shade of red, and his eyes narrowed. Susan's hand flew to her mouth, her gasp the only sound in the room. "What did you just say?" James's voice was sharp, slicing through the air like a blade. "I'm pregnant," Lily repeated, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't mean for this to happen, but it did, and You're 13, Lily." James's voice boomed, cutting her off. He stood abruptly, the veins in his neck bulging. "How could you let this happen? Do you have any idea what you've done to this family?" Susan reached out to calm him, but he pulled away. "James, please, let's not overreact." "Overreact?" He turned to her, incredulous. "Our daughter has disgraced us, Susan. What will people think? What will they say?" Lily sobbed, her shoulders shaking. "I didn't mean to disgrace anyone. I'm scared, Dad. I need your help." But James was beyond hearing her pleas. His voice grew colder, sharper. "You've ruined your future, Lily. And now you expect us to fix it? To stand by while everyone in town whispers behind our backs?" Susan looked torn, her gaze darting between her husband and her daughter. "James, she's just a child. She needs us." But James's resolve was unyielding. He pointed toward the door. "If she wants to act like an adult, she can face the consequences like one. Lily, pack your things. You're leaving this house tonight." The words hit Lily like a physical blow. "You can't mean that," she whispered. "James." Susan's voice cracked with desperation. But James turned away, his jaw set. "I've made my decision." Susan tried to protest, but the weight of James's authority, years of following his lead, kept her rooted in place. Lily, tears streaming down her face, ran upstairs to her room. As she packed a small bag, her hands shaking uncontrollably, memories flooded her mind, birthday mornings with pancakes, Christmas evenings by the fire, her parents cheering at her school plays. The life she knew was slipping through her fingers, replaced by a terrifying uncertainty. Susan appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Lily," she whispered, stepping into the room. "Mom, please," Lily sobbed. "Don't let him do this." Susan's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't reply. Instead, she handed Lily a small envelope. "Take this," she said softly. "It's some money, for food, for wherever you're going." Lily stared at her, her heart breaking. "You're letting him throw me out?" Susan reached for her but stopped short, her arms falling to her sides. I don't know what to do, Lily. I'm sorry." The words stung more than anything James had said. Her mother's apology was a wound that would never fully heal. That night, Lily left the house she had always called home. The cold night air bit at her skin as she walked down the empty street, clutching her small bag and the envelope her mother had given her. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew one thing: she was alone. Behind her, the lights in the Carter house flickered off, leaving her in darkness. Lily wandered aimlessly through the streets of Willow Creek, her small bag slung over her shoulder. The once familiar town now felt foreign, its quietness pressing in on her. Every corner held memories of her childhood, walking to school, laughing with friends, but now those memories felt distant, almost like they belonged to someone else. The cold night air seeped through her thin jacket, and the weight of her situation pressed down on her chest like a stone. As she passed the brightly lit windows of homes, she saw families gathered around dinner tables or watching TV together. She ached for the warmth of her own home, for her parents' voices, even her father's sternness. But there was no going back. Not after what had happened. By midnight, Lily found herself sitting on a bench at the bus station, her hands shaking as she clutched the small envelope of money her mother had given her. She counted the bills, $1.40 in total. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. She stared at the departure board, considering her options. Her instincts told her to run as far as she could, but the reality of her pregnancy tethered her to practicality. She needed shelter, food, and safety, not just for herself but for the baby growing inside her. The thought of being responsible for another life filled her with equal parts terror and determination. After a few hours of sitting in the cold, she remembered a flyer she had once seen at school for a women's shelter in a neighboring town. It was a place for young mothers or those in difficult situations. With a shaky resolve, Lily approached the ticket counter. "One way to Greenfield, please," she said, sliding some of the money across the counter. The bus ride was long and quiet, punctuated only by the occasional sound of a passenger coughing or the hiss of the brakes. Lily kept her face pressed against the window, watching the dark landscape blur past. She felt small, insignificant, like a speck on a vast map with no clear destination. Arriving in Greenfield just before dawn, Lily stepped off the bus and followed the address she had scribbled from memory to the shelter. The building was unassuming, tucked away on a quiet street. A small sign reading New Horizons Women's Shelter hung above the door. Lily hesitated before knocking. Her pride and fear held her back for a moment, but the reality of her situation pushed her forward. A woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a warm smile opened the door. "Hi there, sweetheart," the woman said gently. "You look like you've had a rough night. Come in." Inside, the shelter was modest but clean and welcoming. There were other young women there, some with small children clinging to their legs. Lily felt an overwhelming mix of relief and shame. She wasn't alone anymore, but the weight of her circumstances was still crushing. The woman introduced herself as Diane, the shelter's coordinator. "We'll get you settled in," she said. "First, let's get you something warm to eat and a bed to rest in. You can tell us your story when you're ready." Lily nodded, grateful for the kindness. She was led to a small, shared room where she sank onto the bed. It wasn't much, just a twin mattress with a quilt, but to Lily, it felt like a haven. Over the next few weeks, Lily began to adjust to life at the shelter. She met other girls her age, each with their own stories of heartbreak and resilience. There was Sophie, a 16-year-old who had run away from an abusive home, and Maria, a young mother of twins who worked tirelessly to provide for her children. Their camaraderie was a balm for Lily's loneliness. But the challenges were still daunting. Lily took on odd jobs, washing dishes at a diner, cleaning offices at night, to save money and prepare for the baby. Every dollar she earned was precious, and every decision she made was driven by the thought of providing for her child. The days were grueling. Mornings started early with job searches or work shifts, and evenings were spent attending parenting classes offered by the shelter. Diane, who had become a maternal figure to Lily, often reminded her, "You're stronger than you think, Lily. You'll get through this." Lily clung to those words, repeating them to herself on nights when exhaustion and despair threatened to overwhelm her. One night, after a long shift at the diner, Lily returned to the shelter and found a package waiting on her bed. Inside was a small bundle of baby clothes, carefully folded and tied with a ribbon. There was no note, but Lily knew it was from Diane. Tears streamed down her face as she held the tiny garments. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to imagine her baby, not just as a responsibility, but as a person. Someone who would rely on her love and strength. It was in that moment that Lily made a promise to herself: no matter how hard things got, she would give her child the life they deserved. She would prove to herself, and maybe even to her parents, that she was capable of more than they had believed. By the end of her first trimester, Lily had saved enough money to rent a small room in a boarding house near the shelter. It was far from luxurious, but it was hers. The walls were bare, the bed creaked, and the tiny kitchenette barely functioned, but it was a step toward independence. As she moved in, Diane visited to check on her. "You're doing good, Lily," she said, squeezing her shoulder. "I'm proud of you." The words warmed Lily's heart, but they also reminded her of what she had lost. She longed to hear those words from her own parents, to feel their support. But for now, she knew she had to find strength within herself. The months passed quickly. Lily continued to work, save, and prepare for her baby. The community at the shelter became her surrogate family, offering advice, encouragement, and sometimes just a listening ear. Despite the hardships, Lily began to see a glimmer of hope on the horizon. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was building a life, one step at a time. The Carter house, once filled with a lively rhythm of daily life, felt unnaturally quiet. Days after Lily's departure, Susan moved through the rooms like a ghost, her heart heavy with regret. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. James, however, maintained his stern exterior. He focused on his routines, opening the hardware store each morning, fixing squeaky hinges or broken shelves in his spare time. If the absence of his daughter affected him, he didn't show it. But Susan knew better. She had seen the way he avoided looking at Lily's empty chair at the dining table, or how his hands trembled slightly when he folded the newspaper she had once used to do her homework. Susan couldn't stop thinking about Lily. Every time she passed her daughter's bedroom, she felt the urge to go inside, but James had locked the door. "It's best we move on," he had said firmly, slipping the key into his pocket. But moving on was easier said than done. Susan's thoughts often wandered to where Lily might be, whether she was safe, whether she had enough to eat. Late at night, when James was asleep, Susan would sit by the window, staring into the darkness, hoping to see her daughter walking down the street, coming home. One evening, as James sat in his armchair reading, Susan couldn't hold back any longer. "Do you think she's okay?" she asked, her voice tentative. James didn't look up. "She made her choices, Susan. She'll have to live with them." "But she's just a child," Susan argued, her voice breaking. "She needs us, James." James set his book down with a sigh, his expression hard. "She needed to learn that actions have consequences. Coddling her would have done her no favors." Susan stared at him, disbelief and anger bubbling beneath her sadness. "You talk about consequences, but what about ours? We drove her away. We didn't even try to help her. She's the one who brought this shame into our home," James snapped, his tone cold and final. Susan didn't respond. She knew arguing with him was pointless, but the conversation left a crack in her already fragile heart. Weeks turned into months, and life in the Carter household continued in its muted state. James buried himself in work, and Susan kept up appearances, but neither could escape the void Lily had left behind. One day, while cleaning the house, Susan came across an old photo album. Flipping through the pages, she found pictures of Lily as a little girl, her bright smile lighting up every image. There was one photo of Lily sitting on James's shoulders, her arms stretched out like she was flying. Susan carried the album to James, who was in the garage tinkering with a broken lawnmower. She held it out to him without a word. "What's this?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Just look," she said, her voice trembling. James hesitated before taking the album. He flipped through the pages slowly, his expression unreadable. When he reached the photo of Lily on his shoulders, he stopped. "We were happy then," Susan said softly. James closed the album abruptly and handed it back to her. "What's your point?" "My point," Susan said, her voice growing stronger, "is that we've lost her. Not because she wanted to leave, but because we pushed her away." James looked away, his jaw tightening. "I did what I thought was right." "Was it?" Susan's voice cracked. "Or was it just easier than facing the fact that our little girl needed us, and we let her down?" For the first time, James didn't have a response. He turned back to the lawnmower, but Susan saw the way his shoulders slumped, as if the weight of her words had finally landed. The holidays came and went, each one more somber than the last. Susan tried to keep up their usual traditions, decorating the tree, baking cookies, but without Lily, it all felt hollow. James, who had always been the one to string the lights outside, left the boxes untouched in the garage. On Christmas morning, Susan found herself sitting in Lily's locked room, the door left ajar after James had finally relented. The air was stale, and the bed was still unmade, just as Lily had left it. Susan ran her fingers over the desk, tracing the indentations where Lily had written in her journals. She found a small notebook tucked in a drawer, its pages filled with Lily's neat handwriting. Flipping through it, Susan saw notes about Lily's dreams of becoming a doctor, lists of things she wanted to do: travel to New York, learn French, volunteer at a hospital. At the bottom of one page was a simple sentence that broke Susan's heart. "I just want to make them proud." Tears spilled down Susan's cheeks as she clutched the notebook to her chest. How had they gone so wrong? James's guilt began to surface in small, subtle ways. He started attending church more regularly, sitting in the back pew where he wouldn't have to face too many familiar faces. He gave larger tips to young waitresses at the diner, women who reminded him of Lily. One day, while stocking shelves at the hardware store, he overheard two customers talking about their children. "My daughter just started college," one man said proudly. "It's tough letting them go, but you just want the best for them, you know?" James's hands froze mid-motion. The man's words cut deep. He thought of Lily, of her ambition and determination, and of how he had dismissed it all in a moment of anger. That night, he sat at the dining table long after Susan had gone to bed. He stared at Lily's empty chair, his heart heavy with regret. Susan, meanwhile, began to take small steps toward finding Lily. She called the school to see if they had any information, but they hadn't heard from her since she left. She even reached out to a few of Lily's friends, but none of them knew where she had gone. Despite the dead ends, Susan refused to give up. She started saving small amounts of money each week, tucking it away in case they ever needed to help Lily. James and Susan never spoke about it, but the weight of their decision lingered in every corner of the house. Each day that passed without word from Lily was another reminder of what they had lost. Deep down, both of them knew the truth: the life they had built, the one they thought they were protecting, was crumbling. And unless they found a way to make things right, they might never have the chance to repair it. The morning sunlight filtered through the single window of Lily's small rented room, casting a soft glow over the modest space. The room was sparse but organized: a twin bed, a second-hand dresser, and a tiny table with a lamp she had picked up at a thrift store. On the table lay a stack of parenting books, a notebook filled with her handwritten plans, and a calendar marked with the due date circled in red, May 16th. Lily had settled into a rhythm, one built on necessity and perseverance. Each day began early. She woke up before dawn, prepared a simple breakfast, and headed off to one of her 2 part-time jobs. Her mornings were spent washing dishes at a local diner, and her evenings cleaning office buildings in Greenfield's business district. The hours were long and the work exhausting, but Lily refused to give up. Between shifts, she attended parenting classes offered by the shelter. It was there that she met other young mothers, many of whom were juggling even more overwhelming circumstances. They shared stories, advice, and encouragement, creating a sense of community that Lily hadn't realized she desperately needed. One of those friends was Sophie, a bubbly 16-year-old with a toddler named Max. Sophie's positivity was contagious, even in the face of adversity. "You've got this, Lily," she said one afternoon as they sat in the shelter's common room, folding donated baby clothes. "You're stronger than you think." At first, Lily had dismissed those words as empty encouragement, but over time, she began to believe them. Her confidence grew with each small victory, saving enough money to buy a crib, learning how to prepare nutritious meals for herself and the baby, and even managing to pass the GED test after weeks of late-night studying. The day she received her GED certificate was a turning point. Lily stood in the community center gymnasium, surrounded by other graduates and their families. The applause was deafening as names were called one by one, but Lily stood alone. No family members waited in the audience to cheer her on, no one to snap a picture as she crossed the stage. Still, when she held the certificate in her hands, she felt a sense of pride she hadn't felt in a long time. "This is for you," she whispered, resting her hand on her growing belly. Diane, the shelter coordinator who had become a surrogate mother figure to Lily, was there to celebrate with her. "This is just the beginning," Diane said, pulling her into a warm hug. "You're going to do great things, Lily. I know it." With her GED in hand, Lily set her sights on the next goal, nursing school. It wasn't the medical degree she had dreamed of as a child, but it was a step in the right direction. She applied to the local community college, writing an essay about her journey and her desire to help others. When the acceptance letter arrived, Lily cried tears of joy for the first time in months. It was proof that she was capable of building a better future, not just for herself, but for her baby. Caleb was born on a rainy afternoon in May, his first cries filling the small delivery room. Lily held him close, marveling at the tiny fingers that curled around hers, the soft whimper that escaped his lips as he nestled into her chest. "You're perfect," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "And I'm going to give you everything you need. I promise." The first few months of motherhood were a blur of sleepless nights, feedings, and endless diaper changes. Lily had thought she understood exhaustion before, but nothing had prepared her for the all-consuming demands of caring for a newborn. Still, she persevered. Her jobs became even more grueling as she balanced work with parenting, but she refused to let anything deter her. Diane and the other women at the shelter helped where they could, offering to babysit Caleb while Lily worked or studied. When Caleb was 6 months old, Lily started her first semester of nursing school. Juggling coursework, jobs, and motherhood felt impossible at times, but Lily reminded herself of the promises she had made to her son. She studied late into the night after Caleb fell asleep, often nodding off with a textbook open on her lap. Despite the challenges, Lily excelled. Her professors were impressed by her determination and resilience, and she quickly became a standout student. One professor, Dr. Patel, took a particular interest in her. "You've been through more than most people your age," she said during office hours one day. "But you've turned that struggle into strength. Keep that up, and you'll go far." Lily clung to those words on the hard days when exhaustion and self-doubt crept in. Over the years, Lily's hard work began to pay off. She graduated at the top of her class, earning her nursing degree and securing a job at Greenfield General Hospital. Her first day on the job felt surreal as she walked through the halls in her crisp uniform, a stethoscope around her neck. "This is just the beginning," she thought to herself, echoing Diane's words from years earlier. By the time Caleb was 4, Lily had moved into a small but comfortable apartment. The walls were adorned with crayon drawings and framed photos of the two of them, Lily's favorite being a snapshot of Caleb grinning in his tiny graduation cap from preschool. One evening, as Lily tucked Caleb into bed, he looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Mommy, do I have a grandma and grandpa?" Lily froze, her heart aching at the question. She hadn't spoken to her parents in years, and the thought of them still stirred a mix of anger, sadness, and longing. "Yes, you do," she said finally, brushing a curl off his forehead. "But they live far away. Can we visit them someday?" Caleb asked, his voice hopeful. "Maybe," Lily said softly. "Maybe one day." Lily often wondered what her parents would think if they could see her now. Would they be proud of the life she had built? Of the way she had turned her pain into purpose? Or would they still see her as the scared, pregnant teenager they had turned away? She didn't know if she would ever have the courage to find out, but one thing was certain: Lily had proven to herself that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. And as she watched Caleb sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath, she knew that every sacrifice, every hardship, had been worth it. In Willow Creek, time moved slowly. The seasons shifted, but for James and Susan Carter, the days felt stagnant, weighed down by an emptiness they couldn't shake. The absence of Lily had become a silent presence in their home. Her name was rarely spoken, yet every corner of the house seemed to echo with reminders of her. Susan often found herself in Lily's room, now unlocked but left exactly as it was the night she had left. The bed remained unmade, and the desk was cluttered with remnants of her teenage years, school notebooks, a hairbrush, and an old music box. Susan would sit on the edge of the bed, turning the small crank of the music box and listening to its soft tune, tears filling her eyes. "I miss her," she admitted one evening as she sat across from James at the dinner table. Her voice was quiet, but the weight of the words was immense. James didn't look up from his plate. "We've been over this, Susan." "No, James," she said firmly, setting her fork down. "We haven't. We've been pretending that we're fine, but we're not. She's our daughter. She needed us, and we gave her what she deserved," James interrupted, his voice sharp. "Actions have consequences. You think it was easy for me to make that decision? I did it because I thought it would teach her something. And what did it teach her?" Susan's voice cracked. "That her parents would abandon her when she needed them the most. That we cared more about our reputation than her well-being." James said nothing. His jaw tightened, and he pushed his plate away, but Susan could see the conflict in his eyes. James carried his guilt like a shadow, one he couldn't outrun no matter how hard he tried. At the hardware store, he found himself pausing whenever he saw a young girl browsing the aisles with her parents, imagining for a fleeting moment that it was Lily. When a local customer mentioned their child graduating from college, James's stomach twisted with jealousy and regret. What milestones had he missed in Lily's life? What kind of woman had she grown into? He began to attend church more frequently, seeking solace in the quiet pews. During one sermon, the pastor spoke about forgiveness and redemption, and James felt a pang of guilt so sharp that it left him breathless. Could he ever be forgiven for what he had done? Could he forgive himself? Susan, meanwhile, had grown bolder in her attempts to find Lily. She started small, asking around discreetly among Lily's old friends and teachers. Most had lost touch with her after she left, but one teacher mentioned hearing about a women's shelter in Greenfield. Susan clung to that small piece of information like a lifeline. She began researching shelters in the area, calling anonymously to inquire if anyone named Lily Carter had stayed there. Most of her inquiries led to dead ends, but she refused to give up. One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table with her notes spread out before her, James walked in. He eyed the papers skeptically. "What's all this?" "I'm trying to find her," Susan said without hesitation. James's expression darkened. "We've been through this. If she wanted to come back, she would have." Susan stood, anger bubbling to the surface. "Maybe she doesn't think she can come back, James." Maybe she thinks we don't want her anymore because that's exactly what we told her." Her voice broke, but she didn't stop. "I can't sit here and do nothing while our daughter is out there alone." James didn't respond. He simply turned and walked out of the room, but the tension lingered. The months stretched on, and with each passing day, the weight of their decision grew heavier. James found himself staying later at the hardware store, avoiding the quiet of the house. One night, as he was closing up, a young woman came in with a baby strapped to her chest. She was flustered, juggling a diaper bag and a list of items she needed for a small home repair. "Take your time," James said gruffly, though his eyes softened as he watched her struggle. When she approached the counter to pay, the baby cooed and reached for James's hand. "He's adorable," James said, his voice quieter than usual. "Thanks," the woman said, smiling. "He's a handful, but he's my world." As James handed her the bag, her words echoed in his mind. "He's my world." Wasn't that how he had once felt about Lily? The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had failed her. He had failed as a father. Susan's persistence eventually led her to a breakthrough. She received a call from a shelter in Greenfield confirming that a young girl named Lily Carter had stayed there several years ago. However, they couldn't provide more details due to privacy policies. Still, it was enough to reignite Susan's hope. She sat James down that evening and told him what she had learned. "She's alive, James. She's alive, and she was in Greenfield. That means she's somewhere close." James didn't react immediately. He sat in silence, staring at his hands. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "What if she doesn't want to see us?" Susan reached for his hand. "Then at least we'll know we tried." For the first time in years, James let his guard down. His shoulders slumped, and his eyes filled with unshed tears. I don't know how to face her. How do I look her in the eye after what I did?" Susan squeezed his hand tightly. "We'll find a way. Together." Their search didn't yield immediate results, but it marked a shift in their relationship. The walls James had built around himself began to crumble, and Susan's determination breathed new life into their hope. For the first time in years, they felt like they were moving towards something, rather than being stuck in the painful stillness of regret. The rain poured heavily on Willow Creek, creating rivulets that snaked along the quiet streets. Inside the small community hospital, Lily moved briskly through the hallways, her scrubs slightly damp from the storm outside. Her stethoscope hung around her neck, a badge of the hard work and determination that had brought her to this point. Now a nurse at Greenfield General Hospital, she had volunteered to assist in Willow Creek's medical relief efforts after a devastating flood had left many townspeople injured and displaced. It had been over 14 years since Lily had left Willow Creek. As she walked the halls of the hospital, memories of her childhood surfaced, running through these very streets, her parents waiting for her at the front door after school. The town hadn't changed much, but Lily felt worlds away from the girl she had been when she left. Now she was a woman, a mother, and a professional. Caleb, her 14-year-old son, was back in Greenfield, staying with a friend while she worked the long shifts required of the emergency response team. She had told him stories about Willow Creek, but she hadn't prepared him, or herself, for the possibility of coming face to face with the past. In the middle of her shift, as Lily organized medical supplies in one of the patient wings, a nurse called her over. "Lily, we've got an incoming patient, older male, injured while helping with flood cleanup. Can you take this one?" "Of course," Lily said, grabbing a chart from the nurse's outstretched hand. When the paramedics wheeled the patient into the room, Lily's heart froze. Lying on the stretcher, pale and exhausted, was James Carter. Her breath caught as she stared at him. His face was more weathered, his hair peppered with gray, but there was no mistaking him. Memories surged forward unbidden, his booming voice, his stern gaze, the finality in his tone the night he had told her to leave. "Is everything okay, Nurse Carter?" the paramedic asked, snapping her out of her daze. "Yes," Lily said quickly, regaining her composure. "Let's get him stabilized." James didn't seem to recognize her at first. His eyes fluttered open briefly as they moved him to the hospital bed, but he was too weak to speak. Lily focused on the task at hand, checking his vitals, dressing the wound on his arm, and noting his dehydration. As she worked, her hands trembled slightly. The man lying before her was the same one who had cast her out of his life, but now, he was vulnerable, needing her care. Hours later, James had regained consciousness. He blinked groggily, his gaze falling on Lily as she checked the drip attached to his arm. "Where am I?" he croaked. "You're at Willow Creek Community Hospital," Lily said, keeping her tone professional. James frowned, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face. There was a flicker of recognition, but he didn't say anything. Lily finished her check and stepped back, her heart pounding. She had been dreading this moment for years, imagining 1,000 different scenarios of what she might say to him if they ever met again. Now, faced with the reality, she felt a mix of anger, sadness, and an odd sense of detachment. Later that evening, Susan arrived at the hospital. Her face was pale, and her hands shook as she approached the nurse's station. "I'm here to see James Carter," she told the nurse on duty. When Susan entered the room, her eyes immediately fell on Lily, who was tidying up. For a moment, the two women just stared at each other. Susan's breath hitched, and her eyes filled with tears. "Lily," she whispered, her voice trembling. Lily straightened, gripping the edge of the bed frame for support. "Mom," she said quietly, the word unfamiliar on her tongue after so many years. Susan rushed forward, her hands outstretched as if to embrace Lily, but she stopped short, unsure. "It's really you," she said, her voice breaking. "You're here." "I'm here," Lily replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. James, who had been resting, stirred at the sound of Susan's voice. He opened his eyes, glancing between the two women. His face paled further as realization dawned. "Lily," he rasped. "Yes," she said, her tone sharper now. "It's me." The room grew heavy with silence. Susan was the first to break it, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Lily, I've been trying to find you for years. I didn't know where to start. I didn't know if you'd even want to see us after everything." Lily crossed her arms, her expression guarded. "You didn't know where to start? Maybe with an apology. Maybe by asking if I was alive. It took me being in the same room for you to find me." Susan's tears flowed freely now. "You're right," she admitted. "We failed you. I failed you. I've regretted it every single day since you left." James struggled to sit up, his face contorted with pain. "Lily," he began, his voice hoarse. He faltered, the weight of his guilt rendering him speechless. "You made your decision," Lily said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You chose your pride over your daughter. Do you know what it was like to be 13, alone, and terrified? Do you have any idea what I went through?" Susan sobbed quietly, her hands covering her face. James looked down, his eyes filled with shame. I thought I was doing what was best," he said weakly. "I thought it would make you stronger." "Well, it did," Lily said, her voice firm. "But not because of you. I became strong because I had no other choice." The tension in the room was palpable, but beneath the anger and sadness, there was something else, a faint, fragile thread of hope. Susan stepped forward, her voice trembling but earnest. "Lily, we can never undo what we did. But please let us try to make it right." Lily hesitated, her gaze shifting between her parents. Her anger was justified, but as she looked at their faces, worn, regretful, and vulnerable, she felt a flicker of the love she had buried long ago. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said honestly. "Not yet." Susan nodded, her tears subsiding. "We'll do whatever it takes. Just don't walk away again. Please." James, too weak to speak further, reached out a trembling hand toward Lily. She hesitated, then placed her hand over his, her touch tentative but meaningful. "I'm not the same person I was," Lily said softly. I've built a life, a good one. And I have a son, your grandson." Susan gasped, her eyes widening with surprise and wonder. "You have a son?" "Yes," Lily said. "His name is Caleb. And he's the best thing that's ever happened to me." For the first time, a faint smile crossed James's face. "Caleb," he murmured, as if testing the name. Lily's heart softened just slightly. "He's the reason I'm here. The reason I kept going when I didn't think I could." The conversation paused as a nurse entered to check on James, but the unspoken understanding in the room was clear. The road to reconciliation would be long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, there was a glimmer of possibility. Lily left the hospital room that evening, her emotions swirling. The encounter with her parents had been intense, dredging up years of pain she thought she had buried. Yet, as she walked back to the nurse's station, she couldn't shake the image of her father's trembling hand or the raw anguish in her mother's eyes. That night, as she lay in the small staff quarters provided for emergency volunteers, Lily replayed the conversation in her mind. Her heart ached with conflicting feelings, anger, sadness, and a faint, reluctant hope. Caleb's voice echoed in her thoughts, "Do I have a grandma and grandpa?" She had been evasive when he asked, unsure of how to bridge the gap between the past and the present. Now, she wondered if this moment could be the beginning of something new. The next morning, Susan arrived at the hospital alone. She found Lily in the break room, sipping coffee before the start of her shift. Lily looked up as Susan entered, the awkward silence stretching between them. "Do you have a minute?" Susan asked softly. Lily hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." Susan sat down across from her, her hands clasped tightly together. "I wanted to talk to you, just the two of us." Lily leaned back, her arms crossed defensively. "Okay." Susan took a deep breath, as if bracing herself. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I've thought about this moment for years, wondering if I'd ever get the chance to say how sorry I am. What we did to you, what I let happen, it's my biggest regret." Lily studied her mother's face, noting the deep lines of worry and sadness etched into her features. "You didn't stop him," Lily said, her voice calm but edged with pain. "You handed me that envelope and let me walk out the door." Susan flinched as if struck, her voice breaking. "I know. I was weak. I should have fought for you, but I didn't. And I've lived with that guilt every single day." Lily's throat tightened. She wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the bitterness that had protected her for so long. But seeing her mother's vulnerability chipped away at the walls she had built. "I survived," Lily said finally. "Not because of you or Dad, but in spite of you. I had to grow up fast. I had to figure everything out on my own." Susan nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "And you did. You built a life, a beautiful life. I see that, and I'm so proud of you, Lily." Lily's heart ached at the words she had longed to hear for years. She blinked back tears, unsure of how to respond. "It doesn't erase what happened," she said quietly. "I know it doesn't," Susan replied. "But I'm here now, and I want to be part of your life again, your life and Caleb's. If you'll let me." Later that afternoon, Lily visited James's hospital room. He was sitting up in bed, his face pale but alert. When Lily entered, he straightened, his expression unreadable. "Hi," she said, her voice hesitant. "Hi," he replied, his tone equally tentative. Lily pulled up a chair beside the bed, the silence between them heavy. She glanced at the flowers on the bedside table, a simple arrangement Susan had brought that morning. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Your mother said you have a son," James said finally, breaking the silence. "I do," Lily replied. "His name is Caleb. He's 14. James nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "I missed a lot," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "Yes, you did," Lily said bluntly. "You missed everything." James swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the blanket. "I thought I was teaching you a lesson," he admitted. "I thought it would make you stronger, force you to take responsibility. But I see now, I see how wrong I was. Lily's throat tightened. She had imagined this moment countless times, picturing what she would say to him, how she would confront him. But now, sitting here, she found herself at a loss for words. "You threw me out," she said, her voice trembling. "I was a kid. I needed you, and you threw me out." James closed his eyes, his face contorted with pain. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I was too proud, too stubborn to admit I was wrong. I failed you, Lily. I failed as a father." The admission hung in the air, raw and unvarnished. Lily felt a lump rise in her throat. For so long, she had carried the weight of his rejection, the pain of his harsh words. Hearing him acknowledge his failure didn't erase the hurt, but it was a step she hadn't thought he would ever take. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said, her voice breaking. "Not yet." James nodded, his eyes glistening. "I understand. But I want to try. I want to make things right, if you'll let me." That evening, Lily sat outside the hospital on a bench, watching the rain drizzle softly onto the parking lot. Susan joined her, sitting down quietly by her side. "You spoke to him?" Susan asked. Lily nodded. "Yeah. And?" "I don't know," Lily admitted. "I don't know if I can forgive him. Or you. It's a lot." Susan placed a hand on Lily's arm. "Take your time," she said gently. "We're not going anywhere." For the first time in years, Lily felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning. The following week, Lily decided to bring Caleb to Willow Creek. She hadn't planned for it to happen so soon, but something about her parents' vulnerability, and the honesty of their regret, had shifted something inside her. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was enough to make her want to extend a bridge for Caleb's sake. The drive to the town was quiet. Caleb sat in the passenger seat, his eyes glued to the passing countryside. He had heard bits and pieces about his grandparents over the years, but Lily had always been careful not to give away too much. Now, with the town's familiar landmarks coming into view, he broke the silence. "Are they nice?" he asked suddenly. Lily gripped the steering wheel tighter, considering her answer. "They made some mistakes," she said carefully. "Big ones. But they're trying to make things right." Caleb nodded thoughtfully. "I guess everyone deserves a second chance." Lily glanced at him, her heart swelling with pride. "You're a good kid, you know that?" Caleb grinned. "I try." When they arrived at the Carter house, Susan was waiting on the porch. She had tidied the front yard and hung a small welcome sign on the door. When she saw Lily's car pull up, she clutched her hands together, her eyes misting over. Caleb stepped out first, looking around curiously. Susan hesitated for a moment before approaching him. "You must be Caleb," she said softly. "Yeah," he replied, his tone friendly but cautious. "You're my grandma, right?" Susan nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I am." She crouched slightly, her voice trembling. "And I've been waiting so long to meet you." Caleb glanced at Lily for reassurance, and when she nodded, he turned back to Susan and gave her a tentative hug. The gesture broke the dam of tension that had been building since Lily's arrival. Susan held Caleb tightly, her sobs muffled against his shoulder. Lily stood by the car, watching the scene unfold. Her chest tightened, and she had to take a deep breath to keep her emotions in check. She wasn't ready to dive into forgiveness, but seeing her mother embrace Caleb made her feel a glimmer of hope that reconciliation was possible. Inside, the house looked almost exactly as Lily remembered it. The same floral-patterned curtains hung in the windows, and the faint smell of lemon cleaner lingered in the air. Memories of her childhood came flooding back, some sweet, some painful. James was sitting in his recliner when they walked in. His face lit up when he saw Caleb, but he stayed seated, as if afraid to approach. "Hi," Caleb said, breaking the silence. James smiled faintly. "Hi, Caleb. I'm your grandpa." Caleb studied him for a moment before stepping closer. Mom says you used to own a hardware store. Is it still open? James chuckled, the sound rusty but genuine. No, I retired a few years ago. But I can still fix just about anything. If you ever need something fixed, I'm your guy. Cool, Caleb replied with a grin. Lily stood in the doorway, watching as Caleb's easy nature began to chip away at the tension. She didn't step forward, though. She wasn't ready for that just yet. Over the next few days, Caleb spent time with his grandparents, asking questions and sharing stories about his life. Susan couldn't get enough of him. She doted on him, cooking his favorite foods and listening intently as he talked about school, his friends, and his love for basketball. James, though quieter, found ways to connect with Caleb. They worked together on small projects in the garage, and Caleb seemed to enjoy learning from his grandfather's years of experience. Lily observed from a distance, torn between relief and hesitation. Seeing Caleb bond with her parents was bittersweet. She couldn't deny the joy it brought her, but it also stirred up old wounds that hadn't fully healed. One evening, as Caleb slept in the guest room, Lily sat outside on the porch with Susan. The two women sipped tea, the silence between them comfortable but heavy with unspoken words. I wanted to thank you for bringing Caleb, Susan said softly. He's wonderful. You've done an amazing job raising him. Lily nodded, staring out at the darkened street. He's my whole world. Susan hesitated before speaking again. I know we can never undo what happened. But I hope, someday, you'll let us be a part of your world, too. Lily didn't respond right away. She thought about the years of pain, the nights she cried herself to sleep, the anger that had kept her moving forward. But she also thought about Caleb's smile when he talked about his grandparents, the way he laughed at James's stories or helped Susan in the kitchen. I don't know if I can ever forget what happened, Lily said finally. But maybe we can start fresh. Susan reached over and placed a hand on Lily's. That's all I could ever ask for. The next morning, James approached Lily while Caleb was outside playing basketball. He looked nervous, his hands fidgeting at his sides. Can we talk? He asked. Lily crossed her arms, nodding. Sure. James took a deep breath, his voice low and steady. I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About how I let my pride get in the way. You were right. I let you down when you needed me the most, and I'll never forgive myself for that. Lily's throat tightened, but she stayed silent, letting him continue. I want to do better, he said, his eyes meeting hers. Not just for you, but for Caleb. I want to be someone he can look up to. And I want to make things right with you, no matter how long it takes. Lily studied him, searching for any hint of insincerity, but all she saw was a man who was deeply sorry. She nodded slowly. It's going to take time, Dad. I can't just forget everything overnight. I understand, James said. But I'll be here. Whatever it takes. As the visit came to an end, Lily and Caleb packed their things and prepared to return to Greenfield. Susan hugged Caleb tightly, promising to visit soon, and James gave him a firm handshake that quickly turned into an awkward but heartfelt hug. As Lily stood by the car, Susan approached her one last time. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. For giving us this chance. Lily nodded, her expression softening. Don't waste it. As they drove away, Caleb looked over at Lily. So, what do you think? Are they okay? Lily smiled faintly, her eyes focused on the road ahead. They're trying, she said. And that's a start. Back in Greenfield, Lily hung a new picture on the wall, a snapshot of Caleb standing between James and Susan, all three of them smiling. It wasn't a perfect picture, but it represented something Lily hadn't been sure was possible, a new beginning. And as she looked at it, she felt a small but undeniable sense of peace.